Hello, this is Jason Matthews. I am a recently retired law enforcement officer, and today I'm going to be answering the question, should women be allowed in law enforcement? And I think you're going to find I have a very controversial answer to that question. I'm not going to be politically correct. I can have a personal opinion, but it's based on my many years of law enforcement experience, and before that, the U.S. military. But before we get started, if you support the police, click the like button. And if you do not support the police, click the dislike button. I'm just curious of where you stand, and it's completely anonymous. Let your voice be heard. All right, let's get started. Right now, at the beginning of the video, I'm going to give you my answer, and then I'm going to explain myself. So my answer to the question, should women be allowed in law enforcement, is no. They should not be generally allowed in law enforcement. But there's a caveat. There is a caveat here. So I'm going to say, in 99% of circumstances, women should not be in law enforcement. And I'm going to explain myself. And I'm going to set some background here for you. I'm Generation X. And so this does play a little bit into this, because Generation X, we're kind of the generation in between the baby boomers and the millennials. And so we're kind of the bridge or the gap in our way of thinking, generally speaking. I'm generalizing here as a general trend. So we grew up in the times of one telephone in the house, rotary dial telephones as kids, having just a few channels on television. And then as time went on, growing up, getting cable television, MTV, these type of things. And then eventually moving on to the birth of the internet in our early 20s or mid-20s, depends on when you were born. And then the bridging the gap to the millennials. And so our experiences are, we could say, kind of the old world before the internet, before easy access to things, to now where the millennials, basically, for the most part, they were born into the technology and internet age. And so there's some cultural differences here. And Generation X identifies with some of the old thinking of the baby boomers and such. And so I can see that in myself. Now, it doesn't mean that it's right or wrong, but I'm setting that as a background for you to understand where some thinking may be coming from. And so the answer of no, with the caveat of, I will say, generally speaking, overwhelmingly, I believe that women should not be in law enforcement. Why is that? And actually, let me step back a minute also. I actually believe that a lot of men should not be in law enforcement also, for some of the same reasons. But if we compare the average man to the average woman, I do not believe that the average woman should be in law enforcement. Should there be an outright restriction of women being in law enforcement? No, probably not. I'll say 1% of women could probably be fine in law enforcement under ideal circumstances. Now, I say ideal circumstances, and why do I say that? What I mean by that is, yes, we see this all the time. Women and many men in law enforcement who I believe have no business being in law enforcement, they can function. They can barely get by on a day-to-day basis. That's true. But just because they can barely get by doesn't mean it's okay or it's an ideal situation. And the reason why I do not believe that, I'm just throwing out a number, 99%, it could be plus or minus, is because of physical fitness, physical strength, and such, and also mindset. We have to understand when we go to mindset, men, as far as testosterone, as far as their way of seeing the world in general, their world view as a man is more aggressive, is more geared towards law enforcement and dealing with people that need to be dealt with many times in a harsh way, and also enduring mentally the hardships of law enforcement in certain circumstances. But physically, now, myself, I was a fitness instructor, a certified fitness instructor in law enforcement. And so myself, just so you know my background, I'm speaking as someone who is at the very top of law enforcement, physically speaking. I always thought it was important because I came out of the military, out of the infantry, and I always just believed that physical fitness was important, and I made it a priority. And many people do not make it a priority. That's a shame. That is a shame. And one of the reasons that people, law enforcement, are not respected is not just because of physical fitness, but because of the way they look. How are you going to be obese and be respected by the public? So what happens is, and I've referenced this in other videos, is in many circumstances, the way it works is, I'd say in the vast majority of departments or agencies, at least to get into the academy or get hired at the department, you have to pass physical standards. And that's, it could be a many different things, different events that you might have to pass to get in, which could be push-ups, sit-ups, pull-ups in some circumstances, a run, body fat percentages, and it varies. It varies by department, it varies by agency on what the events could be. But also, it depends on most departments that I've seen and agencies I've seen these days. There's no ongoing testing once you're hired. It's basically once you're hired, you're on, you pass the test, and you're good for the next 30 years. There are exceptions, but it's a shame to me. It's a doggone shame. And I'll probably do a separate video about this. But why am I referencing all this background information in reference to why I believe that most women, 99% roughly, should not be in law enforcement? We have to understand, physically speaking, women cannot handle the rigors physically that men can handle. They're just not built that way. It's nothing bad against women, but they cannot do as many push-ups. They cannot do as many pull-ups. And I'm talking, again, averages. Yes, if you get an obese man against a very fit woman, the women can probably do more. But we're talking averages here. We're talking the average man versus the average woman. And why do women, or why do people in general, law enforcement, need to be physically fit? Why? They need to be able, number one, to defend themselves and overpower suspects possibly in a fight, or if they are receiving active resistance from a suspect. And yes, of course, any suspect at any time could potentially overpower any police officer, whether they're male or female. If they're Hulk Hogan, they're probably going to be able to overpower any officer, any average officer. But when we we got to put averages here in perspective. The average suspect versus the average law enforcement officer. And this is a reason why I'm very much a proponent of ongoing fitness standards, not only passing tests throughout the career, maybe once a year, a fitness test with all those events that they had to pass coming into the department or agency, but also ongoing once a year. And if you don't pass, maybe, you get one chance and then you're out. That's the way I would do it. Because this is your career. We need to take ownership of it. We need to take it seriously. I mean, this is what we do. You can't be obese and you can't be out of shape and do your job. Now, I know that medical issues come up, and those can be addressed for a certain amount of time, I would say. I mean, if you're having medical issues where you can't work out, that's understandable for a certain amount of time because there's injuries, there's things that happen. But, being a law enforcement officer is a privilege. It's not a right. And you can be fired. You can be let go. You can be put on disability, whatever the case may be. My opinion is we need to have the fittest officers possible. And me, I would have people pass pretty high level of fitness to remain in the police force. It's very much like the military. But again, I'm coming from the military, from that mindset. But I think it's a good mindset because when the standards are raised for everyone, people generally adapt to the higher standards. So going back to why I believe that women should not be in law enforcement, generally speaking, should there be a ban, an outright ban? No, I don't think so. But we have to understand if we raise these standards so that police need to continually pass maybe once a year these physical fitness standards, including body fat, then that's going to be pretty tough, especially if they're all one standard. Because right now, they're not equal. Women, generally speaking, I can't speak for all departments or all agencies, but generally speaking, women have different physical standards than men. They're generally lower. Now, I think the runs are about the same, but it goes generally by age, and it usually goes by gender, and it keeps decreasing and decreasing by age. Now, me, as old as I am, I could still beat most of 20 years old. I could still pass. When I retired, I could still pass. I was that high of fitness that I could pass the 20-year-old standards. And not only just pass, but be at a pretty good percentage. I could probably be 80% of the 20%, the 20-year-olds range standards. Because I took pride in what I was doing. I took pride in myself as a law enforcement officer, in my job, in my profession. I did not allow myself to be out of shape. But so if the standards are raised and they are universal across all genders, male and female, sexes, whatever you want to call it, women are going to have a very hard time passing those standards. Now, yes, there is an argument to be made. How do you really gauge? How do you really get a good test that will measure what a law enforcement officer needs to pass to equal the rigors of the physical rigors of the job? In other words, if they got into a fight with a suspect, what do they really need to have as far as strength to beat, or endurance to beat that suspect, to win the fight? But I'm going to be honest with you. In my career, and this is almost without exception, this is within the military and law enforcement. I'll probably do a separate video about the military at some point. I mean, I wasn't really around too many females in the military back in the 90s, early 90s, mid 90s. But in my experience in law enforcement, unfortunately, whenever I've been around women, when we're done doing physical tactics and such, it's not equal. It's not equal. I don't know if it's the fault of the men or the women, but they go very soft on the women. They go, like when we're doing takedowns, for example, the women are basically let off the hook, in my experience. They're gone. They go soft on them. They don't want to hurt them because they're female, they're women, and that does no service to the agency. That does no service to the women. Also, whenever I've been in situations where there have been female officers on scene, this is very unfortunate. And maybe it gives me a bias because I didn't work with too many females, but I did work with some. And in the circumstances where there was an arrest where multiple officers were on scene, the female just sat back and watched or did a very minor thing. Something, while everybody else was getting them in handcuffs, they were giving orders or they were standing off to the side or whatever. And then there's also been many times, let me take that back, not many times. There have been some times that I've been on a scene with a female officer and basically, for example, having to go into an area to search for a suspect, they were afraid to go alone. Now, I can't speak for all females out there. Maybe there's some badass females out there, but I haven't seen them. Show me one. I really want to see this and not be in the movies. I'm sure there's some out there, and that's why I say I cannot exclude them completely. But let's be realistic here. Let's be very, very honest, and let's be very realistic. Based on my decades of experience, this is what I saw. And I wish it was otherwise. But we have to be realistic in, if the average female officer were to get into an altercation with a male suspect, it's probably not going to go well for that female because of strength problems. They're more than likely going to be overpowered. And again, I'm not making excuses because there's a lot of males out there who would be overpowered also, unfortunately. So those are the reasons why I believe a high percentage of females should not be in law enforcement. I can't give you an exact percentage. I can only say based on my experience in law enforcement. Raise the standards for everybody. Make them gender neutral. Have one full standard. Have it to get into the law enforcement academy and to get hired, and to have it once a year throughout the entire career. We want the fittest, dedicated officers. If you cannot be in physical shape, shame on you. Shame on you if you're a law enforcement officer and you're out of shape. It looks bad for the profession. It looks bad in these videos. And it just shows what type of employees people are. If I'm a law enforcement officer, I'm going to be the best law enforcement officer I can possibly be. And that was my standard throughout my career. We don't want people who can just barely do the job. We want people who will excel, who will represent the profession with excellence and honor. If you disagree with me, you're welcome to do so. I welcome your feedback. Could I be wrong? Of course I could be wrong. Of course. I don't have an ego to the point where I can't say that I can be wrong. I'm just telling you based on my experience in my decades in the military and law enforcement. Again, maybe I'll do a separate video about the military. But this is generally a law enforcement channel, and that's why I'm focusing on this issue. And this was a pet peeve of mine throughout my career. Will the world continue if nothing changes? Of course, the world will continue. Women are not going out of law enforcement. Women are not going to be excluded from law enforcement. Don't worry. They'll be there. They've been there for decades, and they'll continue to be there. It's politically incorrect to be able to exclude them or exclude a high percentage of them. It's not going to happen. I guarantee you. And I'm not saying it's going to happen. What I am saying is this is my professional and personal opinion based on my experience and what I think in a best case scenario is the right thing to do. Hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy it, click the subscribe button and ring the notification bell to be notified when new videos are released. Take care and have a great day.